Oh my God. Our house is freaking destroyed, Josie. Oh my God. Where's Autumn?
Caught on camera, incredible new video of Friday's powerful EF3 tornado touching down and then sweeping over the town of Andover, Kansas. Wind speeds hit 165 miles an hour and left a path of destruction nearly 13 miles long. More than 1,000 buildings were destroyed.
For most people, that day began like any other. The streets were alive with routine movement, familiar sounds, and the false comfort of normalcy that makes danger feel impossible. Parents rushed children to school, coffee shops filled with the usual morning crowd. Everything felt safe because everything felt familiar. There was no siren cutting through the air. There was no final announcement telling people to run. There was no countdown. What happened next arrived without warning, without mercy, and without giving anyone time to understand what was unfolding around them. The morning had started with clear skies and mild temperatures. Weather forecasts promised nothing unusual. Local meteorologists spoke casually about partly cloudy conditions and a slight chance of afternoon showers. Nothing in their data suggested what was quietly assembling in the atmosphere above. Natural disasters often announce themselves slowly. Storms are tracked on radar for days. Hurricanes are named and monitored, their paths projected hourly. Volcanoes tremble before they erupt. Floods rise gradually, giving people time to evacuate. But this disaster did none of that. It formed quietly, invisibly, beneath conditions that most people did not recognize as dangerous. By the time the signs became obvious, escape was already slipping away. The invisible threat. Meteorologists would later explain that the atmosphere had been building tension for hours, layering instability upon instability in a way that is rare, unpredictable, and terrifying in hindsight. Warm air was rising rapidly while cold air collapsed downward, creating violent energy trapped in the sky. Wind shear was developing at multiple altitudes. Moisture levels were climbing. The atmosphere was becoming a pressure cooker. On paper, it looked like interesting weather, perhaps a strong thunderstorm. In reality, it was a loaded weapon waiting for a trigger. That trigger came suddenly, when everything changed. In one moment, the sky darkened in a way that felt unnatural, as if daylight itself had been swallowed. It was not gradual, it was instant. It was wrong. The wind did not slowly increase, it snapped into existence. 1 second the air was still, the next it was howling with fury. It tore through streets and open spaces with a force that did not feel like weather anymore. It felt alive. People who were outside described the sound first, a deep, continuous roar that drowned out everything else. It made it impossible to hear screams, alarms, or even one's own thoughts. The roar filled everything, vibrating through bodies and bones. Windows began to shatter inward, exploding into rooms and sprays of glass. Trees bent at impossible angles before snapping like matchsticks. Loose objects became weapons, flying at deadly speeds. Trash cans tumbled down streets. Metal signs tore free and sailed horizontally. Debris created a deadly cloud that made being outside a death sentence. Inside the chaos. Inside homes and buildings, confusion turned into panic within seconds. Power failed almost instantly, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness. Phones lost signal. Radio stations went silent. People did not know what was happening, only that something had gone terribly wrong. Some tried to flee, grabbing car keys and rushing toward vehicles, but cars stalled as debris clogged roads within minutes. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Street signs disappeared, landmarks vanished. Every second mattered, and every second was being stolen by chaos. Others were trapped where they stood. In one neighborhood, a family of 5 gathered in a hallway, pressing themselves against interior walls as their building groaned and shook. The The sound above them grew louder, then deeper, as if the earth itself was tearing open. They would later say the most terrifying part was not knowing whether the structure would still exist when the noise stopped. In another area, emergency responders tried desperately to reach people calling for help, but roads were blocked, communication systems were failing. The disaster was moving faster than any response could follow. All their training meant nothing when visibility dropped to zero and conditions changed every few seconds. The randomness of destruction. What made this event especially devastating was how localized and sudden it was. One street could be completely destroyed, while another, just a few hundred meters away, remained almost untouched. This randomness created a false sense of safety for some and instant tragedy for others. Families separated by just a few blocks experienced entirely different events. Some saw minor damage, others saw devastation so complete that their homes simply ceased to exist. The lottery of location determined who lost everything and who lost nothing, and there was no logic anyone could understand. The terrible silence. When the core of the disaster finally passed, it left behind a silence that felt wrong. Not peaceful, not calm, just empty. Broken only by distant sirens, the crackle of damaged power lines, and the sound of people calling out names into spaces that no longer looked familiar. People emerged slowly from wherever they had sheltered, stepping out into a world that had been fundamentally altered in minutes. Entire sections were unrecognizable. Buildings had shifted off their foundations. Vehicles were piled in unnatural positions. Trees lay scattered like debris. The ground itself looked scraped and rearranged by forces beyond human control. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere. Family photographs fluttered in the breeze blocks from the homes they had decorated. Furniture sat in streets. Clothing hung in power lines. The randomness was disorienting and deeply disturbing. Understanding what happened. As daylight returned, the scale began to sink in. Authorities struggled to assess damage because landmarks used for navigation were gone. Aerial footage revealed patterns of destruction that looked almost surgical, carving narrow paths of devastation through populated areas. This was not widespread flooding or slow destruction. This was precision chaos. Survivors told stories that didn't sound real when spoken aloud. People described being lifted off the ground. Others remembered clinging to objects with strength they didn't know they had. Many spoke about the moment they realized they might not survive, and the strange calm that followed that realization. Scientists would later analyze the event, trying to understand how something so violent could form so quickly. Their conclusions were unsettling. Under the right conditions, disasters like this don't need long warnings. They don't need days of buildup. They only need the right balance of invisible forces aligning at the wrong moment. That realization changed how experts thought about forecasting and preparedness. It exposed gaps in warning systems. It showed that some disasters will always move faster than our ability to react. Those answers remained uncertain, but what was certain was that those who survived would never forget. They would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. They would remember how close they came to losing everything in a disaster that arrived without warning, without mercy, and without giving them time to understand what was happening until it was nearly too late. And they would remember the silence that followed, that terrible, empty silence, broken only by sirens, by sparks, by voices calling out names, hoping for answers that might never come.
Bencana gempa dan tsunami di Palu, Sulawesi Tengah.
December 26, 2004, began softly along the shores of Indonesia. The sun was still low, casting warm light over fishing boats tied along the beach. Families who had spent Christmas Eve together were beginning to stir, preparing breakfast or gathering near the water. Tourists stepped onto hotel balconies, admiring the glassy calm of the Indian Ocean, unaware that beneath that calm surface, a force older and more powerful than human history had already been unleashed. What would follow in the next hours would become one of the deadliest natural disasters ever recorded, an event that would change entire nations and carve itself permanently into the memory of the world. At 7:58 a.m. local time, along the floor of the Indian Ocean near the island of Sumatra, enormous tectonic plates shifted with violent force. For hundreds of years, pressure had been building silently between the Indo-Australian and Eurasian plates. On that morning, the stress exceeded the breaking point. The seafloor ruptured along a 1,300-kilometer fault line, lifting a massive slab of ocean floor upward by more than 10 meters. This movement displaced billions of tons of water in a matter of seconds. The energy released was equivalent to more than 20,000 atomic bombs. Yet at the surface, along beaches and towns stretching across Asia, the first sign of disaster seemed deceptively gentle. A faint shudder beneath the feet, a tremor that felt like a passing vibration. Some people felt nothing at all. Others paused briefly in their morning routine, sensing only a small rumble before dismissing it. The epicenter was too far offshore for most communities to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. But in the moments after the seafloor tore open, the ocean began to behave in ways that defied all normal patterns. Along the coast of Aceh in northern Indonesia, fishermen noticed the first ominous changes. The water moved strangely, not in waves, but in a slow, unnatural heaving motion. It felt as if the sea itself were inhaling. Birds that normally soared along the shoreline abruptly turned inland. Dogs barked relentlessly and refused to go near the water. These are signs that indigenous communities had understood for generations, but on this morning, even the elders could not comprehend the scale of what was coming. Then the ocean began to pull back. The receding water exposed vast stretches of seabed that had never been seen before. Coral reefs, seaweed forests, and skeletal remains of ancient marine life lay bare under the rising sun. Fish flopped helplessly on the sand, and curious children ran out to collect them. Tourists pointed their cameras at the unbelievable sight. Many people assumed it was a rare natural phenomenon or a low tide. They could not know that the sea was gathering itself for its return. Further offshore, the displaced water formed a massive wave, silent, dark, and rising. It traveled across the ocean at the speed of a commercial jet. Unlike a normal wave, which breaks gently at the crest, a tsunami carries its energy through the entire water column. It becomes a moving wall of destruction, capable of uprooting forests, pulverizing buildings, and sweeping entire towns away in seconds. When the first wave reached the shores of Aceh in northern Indonesia, it did not appear as a cresting breaker. It rose gradually, like a towering, moving platform of water. Then it slammed forward with unimaginable force. Houses were torn from their foundations and carried inland as if they weighed nothing. Cars floated like toys. The roar of the water drowned out screams, cracking timber and collapsing structures. People clung to anything they could. Tree trunks, floating debris, pieces of rooftops, realizing instantly that they were fighting for their lives. Within minutes, entire blocks of Banda Aceh disappeared beneath churning, debris-filled water. A mother, holding her son, tried to climb to the second floor of her home, only to feel the surge knock them both under. She managed to grip a window frame while waves battered her body, but the current ripped her son from her arms. A fisherman who had spent decades on the water found himself thrown into a violent whirlpool of debris. He survived only because he managed to grasp a large piece of wood as he was swept through the remains of his neighborhood. The tsunami did not behave like a single wave. It came in multiple surges, each one carrying more debris, more destruction, and more force. After the first wave receded, people stumbled through muddy water, believing the worst was over. But within minutes, a second wave surged inland, higher and more violent than the first. Many who had survived the initial strike were swept away in the second assault. By the time the wave reached Sri Lanka, it had traveled thousands of kilometers but had lost none of its power. In the town of Peralaya, one of the most tragic events of the disaster unfolded when the tsunami struck a passenger train, carrying hundreds of people. The force of the water lifted the train off its tracks and hurled it into nearby homes, trapping passengers inside carriages that quickly filled with water. Families clung to each other in darkness as the train shifted and buckled under the pressure. Rescuers later described it as one of the deadliest railway disasters in history, caused not by human error, but by the unstoppable force of the ocean. On the coast of India, fishing villages were obliterated. People awoke to the sound of crashing water and fled barefoot through streets that had turned into rivers. Mothers searching for their missing children screamed into the air, calling names that were swallowed by the noise of the waves. In Tamil Nadu, entire neighborhoods were flattened. Boats were thrown onto roads and rooftops. Marketplaces, houses, and temples were washed away in minutes. In Thailand, on the holiday island of Phuket, tourists were enjoying breakfast on the beach when the ocean suddenly surged upward. Some saw the water rising far offshore and mistook it for a storm. Others stood frozen in disbelief as the sea transformed into a moving wall. One father grabbed his daughter and sprinted through a hotel lobby as the windows shattered and water poured inside. Large beachfront resorts flooded within seconds. Video footage from that day shows people running desperately through swirling water, trying to reach higher ground as furniture, vehicles, and debris crashed around them. The tsunami continued its path westward, reaching the Maldives, Somalia, and even the coast of Kenya. Its reach was so vast that nations separated by thousands of kilometers suffered the same catastrophe within hours of each other. Never before had a single seismic event caused such widespread, simultaneous destruction across so many countries. When the water finally receded, the world saw the scope of the disaster. Vast areas were unrecognizable. Houses had been reduced to fragments. Boats lay stranded far inland. Roads were destroyed. Farmlands were coated in salt water and mud. Everywhere, survivors stumbled among ruins searching for family members, calling out names into an air filled with dust and grief. Some found their loved ones. Others found objects that belonged to them, shoes, toys, clothing, haunting reminders of lives swept away. More than 230,000 people lost their lives. Millions were displaced. Entire communities vanished. The Indian Ocean tsunami became one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history. In the days that followed, rescue teams from around the world arrived to search through debris. Medical workers treated the injured in makeshift clinics. Aid organizations set up shelters for people who had lost everything. But the emotional scars remained long after the physical ruins were cleared. Survivors carried memories of the morning when the sea retreated like a whisper and returned like a monster, reshaping their world forever.